Since we live in a world where technology and entertainment advance at a rapid rate, looking back at old milestones of media can be jarring today. Without established rules and lack of quality control, you'll find discomforting instances of experimentation. No first attempt at something will be seen as on par of the standards we hold today, whether it be the strange direction of early silent films, or the off-feeling aura of early photographs. Just listen to this audio of an early recorder taken from the late 1800s, said to be one of the first audio recordings ever. It sounds almost unworldly, doesn't it? Although historical and groundbreaking for its time period, dated technology and wacky experimentation will make these pieces of history seem jaded and maybe even terrifying for younger generations. A lot of it being something that would never be broadcasted to the world out of its designated time period. But there is one medium that, no matter how far we advance, will always look back in its roots and fascination, even if its roots can be as terrifying as the others. This medium being early 3D games.
It's me, Mario!
To not have this be as general as it is, I will be narrowing down what I feel are the most disturbing instances of a few prominent examples. Some are horror games from the time period that are deliberately scary, and some are games that you would never expect to have sinister undertones at a first glance. At the end, I will discuss why I feel this happens, and these games' broader influence, and how it eventually became a surreal subgenre of horror games. So, before we do, let us look at the events that led up to this point. Around the early to mid-90s, 2D games were starting to look mesmerizing, a far cry from the lab experiments 2 decades earlier. Fluid and clean-looking sprite animations started to become the norm around the time of the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. But although this feat was impressive, it was really taken for granted. Developers were already starting to look past 2-dimensional spaces and were starting to look how to implement 3-dimensional play into video games. And just like how it took over 20 years to seem to perfect 2D games, we would see the gradual rise of 3-dimensional spaces in gaming. Many people like to point to Wolfenstein 3D being the first instance of 3-dimensional movement in games, even being the first result when looking up what was the first 3D game on Google. But it isn't true 3D, it just gives the illusion of 3D. Hell, it's not even the first game to do this. There was another id Software game called Catacombs 3D that used the same technique, and it was eventually perfected by Doom. So what really was the first 3D game? There are a lot of titles that could take the name of first 3D game, but if you really want to go back, you can consider this 1974 lab experiment called Spasm as the first 3D game, but this looks as fun as a geometry test. No, what really is the first true 3D game? Personally, I feel this title goes to Virtua Racing. Although not sold for retail, rather an arcade game, Virtua Racing predates even the first Star Fox game for the SNES by a year. Although not inherently disturbing, the early models of humans in the game can be seen as off-putting by some, and I think it would be safe to say that I am also in that boat. As time went on, we got more games taking advantage of their hardware's capabilities, eventually getting the first home console that popularized 3D movement in video games. Don't get me wrong, the N64 was definitely not the first 3D console. The Sega Saturn predates it by a year, just for an example, but the impression that the Nintendo 64 left on the gaming landscape was astronomical. The leap from 2D to 3D was huge for the time, but you cannot talk about the success of this console without talking about what most people consider the most important game of our time.
It's me, Mario!
Super Mario 64 is an unintentionally terrifying game, And not because of these made-up hoaxes like the Wario apparition. I know this thing was always a meme, but seriously, who saw this video and shit their pants because of it? No. The reason why this game is terrifying is because of the things that are already in the game, but are hidden from plain sight. When taking Super Mario 64 for its face value, you may wonder what is scary about the game. And that's a good question. It's a game made for kids by one of the safest companies out there. What can be scary about it? At its core, Mario 64 isn't a scary game, but it does have a lot of stuff in it that makes it super unnerving. There's the obvious stuff, the eel in Dire Dire Docks, the piano in Big Busan, even the painting to Lethal Lava Land, or the sea creature in Hazy Maze Cave are good examples. But the more you dig, the more you find more obscure feelings of discomfort. A good example could be the atmosphere. The entire castle is evacuated. Spare some toads that don't even feel like they are there. If you walk too far away from them, they will start to fade away as if they're merely a projection. It's just you, and maybe the occasional pink babam here and there. There are also the paintings themselves. The paintings lead to areas unknown, unsure if these are real locations or in their own separate realities. If they really are just paintings, what are the islands in the Babam Battlefield skybox? What happened to the drowned city of Wet Dry World? How did it become submerged in water? Mario 64 tends to leave a lot more questions than answers when it comes to these mysteries, making you fill in your own gaps to figure out what happened in these desolate lands. The fact that it's all up to your interpretation on what happened here is what makes it even more discomforting. There are so many other examples that I can list, but chances are you've heard a lot of this stuff already. But these, and along with the graphics of the game, are why I believe Super Mario 64 is one of the most unintentionally unnerving games to be released. Now that I have explained the unintentional horror of this time period, let's flip the coin to one of the most atmospheric and terrifying games to ever release. Releasing merely a year before the launch of the PlayStation 2, Silent Hill was a late but impactful title for the survival horror genre, and you may be thinking to yourself, well obviously it's scary, it's a horror game, and yes, you are right to make this claim, but let me explain why Silent Hill 1 in particular has this vibe to it that no other game in the series does. Although you can make obvious parallels from this game to the 1996 classic Resident Evil, whether you like one series over another, I personally like the Resident Evil series more. It doesn't take away from my opinion that Silent Hill has one of the most unsettling and dread-inducing atmospheres in any game I have ever played. And it's mainly from the graphics. The limitations of the time give you incredibly low-res and muddy textures that give off a feeling of uneasiness that you wouldn't be able to imitate with any modern textures. If Silent Hill were to ever be remade, I don't think it would be able to rival the feelings of dread these environments give off. In Silent Hill, you feel like you're the only one, the only thing in this world that is alive. It's a feeling like no other in the later Silent Hill games, or even any other modern horror title. Comparing this game to its direct PS2 sequel is kinda tough in some aspects. One thing that is very similar is the character interactions. For comparison, take the Bakers from Resident Evil 7. They are these twisted, possessed individuals that act like a very sadistic family, but you can understand that although they are insane, they are still people. And then you look at the interactions in Silent Hill.
How do you feel?
Oh, like I've been run over by a truck. But I'm alright, I guess.
Glad to hear it.
Cold, dead voice delivery, with no facial expressions at all. The lips don't even move when a character talks. But during parts of the story, you can see more detailed models of these characters, as the game will play these pre-rendered cutscenes way beyond the graphical capabilities of the original PlayStation. This method was called full motion video, FMV for short. FMVs were a popular method of capturing more expressive cutscenes for a main part of a story, and was really commonly used around the time of the PlayStation 1 and 2. These cutscenes have a level of uneasiness completely different to the core game. This isn't even restricted to just Silent Hill. Other games that do this still look incredibly off-putting by today's standards. They are detailed enough to look human, but just that much off to look extremely eerie, bordering the line of the uncanny valley. Early 3D games, for some, are undeniably scary, whether it be what's lying underneath the surface, or what's right in front of you. The dated visual and audio limitations, or full motion video cutscenes, it is undeniable that many early 3D games give off similar feelings of unease, no matter what genre it's going for. There are many examples of this in many other games too, but I want to focus on two from completely opposite ends of the spectrum to give you an idea of this. Many modern horror games and other media have certainly taken advantage of this, with plenty of examples to be named, whether it be the short Siren Head game from a couple of months back, No Players Online, or the fake, but super convincing and impressive Petscop series. All these things are good in their own right, but their biggest flaws are that they are too short, or not even interactive to begin with. That's why I feel there's one standout game in particular that encapsulates all these elements in one game. Lost in Vivo is a psychological and survival horror game releasing in October of 2018. You've probably already seen the far better video explaining why this game is great by the funny TV head guy, so I'll try to keep this brief with a focal point of its graphics. This won't be a review. Lost in Vivo makes use of graphical limitations from early 3D games to make an atmosphere that you couldn't recreate with modern graphics. The enemy designs give me the same feeling of early Silent Hill games, where you can't really tell what anything is, but you know that it is aggressive. And the floating weapons in your hand are reminiscent to early 3D shooters such as GoldenEye, which, in this case, puts a disconnect between the player and the character. It's almost as if the player is no different from the monsters you are fighting. The environments give off the same feeling of dread the early Silent Hill games gave off, with these industrial areas turning into these organic hellscapes, paired up with the aforementioned undefinable enemies. Lost in Vivo really nails the atmosphere of early 3D games, with some additional modern touch-ups to make for a more enjoyable experience. But, with a brief example of something I feel encapsulates the spirit of the disturbing nature of early 3D games aside, why does this phenomenon happen? My theory is the uncanniness of early 3D games. It's kind of the same feeling you'd get while staring at a faceless mannequin. Something that looks almost human, but isn't detailed nor expressive enough to come close to being considered human. But, with video games, there is more of a disconnection with our reality and the reality of the game. Because, well, mannequins are real. The world we see in these games are not. In some instances, it feels like you are looking into an alternate reality that you are never meant to see. The games from this time period have such surreal worlds detached from our reality that it is hard to get immersed in them without feeling uncomfortable. And that is what I think is the key to this phenomenon. Immersion. I don't really know how or what to label this phenomenon, but all I can say is this is what happens when you decide to step into the polygonal nightmares. Alright, I just wanted to say some things here unscripted real quick. Firstly, I'm gonna try to have a better schedule when it comes to making videos. I didn't really plan on taking a 2-month hiatus, but this video took incredibly long to script while in the middle of writing. While I was making this, I actually figured out that someone else made a video on the exact same topic. So I tried my best to make it as unique as I could and not feel like I'm ripping off someone else, while still covering what I wanted to cover. If any of you want to go to Ice Medallion's channel, I highly recommend doing so. He goes way more in depth and covers this stuff in 3 parts with about an hour of content. But anyways, I'm gonna get planning what to do next so I'm not on another long hiatus. Hope to see you the next time I upload. Goodbye everyone.